right, welcome to the panel room. We're here today for our next vampire panel. And before we get started though, let's go ahead around the room again and let everyone know who we've got here and a little bit about your history, as in what you've written that involve vampires. And we'll start with you, Michele.
Hi everyone, I'm Michele Tracy Berger and I am a speculative fiction writer. I tend to write across the speculative fiction universe, and everything I write tends to have an edge of horror. And I have a new story coming out called Blood Saviors in an new anthology called Slay, Tales of the Vampire Noir.
All right, great. John.
Hi, I'm John Hartness, and I am the founder and publisher of Falstaff Books, an independent press based in Charlotte, North Carolina. And as far as vampires go, I haven't seen the sun in 5 years, but I also write the Quincy Harker Demon Hunter series, which features vampires prominently, and the Black Knight Chronicles, where vampire detectives are my protagonists.
Great. Jeremy?
I'm J.F. Lewis. The J stands for Jeremy, the F stands for something else. And I write the Void City series, which has vampires, and the Grudgebearer trilogy, which does not.
All right, and lastly, Gail.
Hi, I'm Gail Z. Martin and Morgan Bryce, and as Gail, I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, and near future post-apocalyptic, as well as some steampunk. And as Morgan, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. All of my epic fantasy series have vampires in them, and sometimes they're the good guys, sometimes not. Most of the urban fantasy series, vamps show up sooner or later. Sometimes they're the good guys and sometimes not. Even in the steampunk, there are vampires. I think you're seeing a trend here.
All right, great. Now, as I mentioned, we've already done one panel on vampires, and I know Jeremy and John were with us for that, but Michele and Gail, you weren't. But let me go ahead and go around with everyone and go over what your first introduction to vampires was. And we'll go ahead and start with you, John.
I don't know that I remember, but the first one I remember is a Captain America comic book where Cap went to England and fought Baron Blood with the British version of Captain America, who was called Union Jack. And Cap, being human, although enhanced, and Baron Blood, being vampire, was kicking Cap's butt. I mean, he was wearing him out. And he went in for the bite. It was over. And that's when we learned that Cap wore chainmail under his tights, because Baron Blood chipped a tooth. And that was my introduction to vampires, and I think that it set the tone for a lot of what I was going to do with vampire fiction.
All right, perfect. Jeremy.
I'm probably going to get the title of this wrong, but I think it actually may have been Abbott and Costello Meet the Wolfman. Which featured almost all the Universal horror monsters. So you had Frankenstein, Wolfman, Invisible Man. I think the Mummy even showed up. But the one that I remember liking the most, where I thought, okay, vampires are really cool. Like John, it's a comic book, and it was when the X-Men fought Dracula, and I loved that. That was the first time I saw the idea that faith was required. Excuse me, to have a cross work. And so you have Wolverine pops his middle claw on each hand and tries to drive Dracula back, and Dracula smacks him into a tree. And then, he says, "You have to have faith, little man." And Nightcrawler says, "Oh, well, if that's what it takes," and pulls up 2 twigs and says, "Back."
I remember that issue.
It's a good issue.
It was. And it was Cap 254. I just looked it up.
Perfect. Gail, how about you?
So my first vampire was Barnabas Collins in Dark Shadows, the original soap opera. I don't know what my mother was thinking, letting me watch it as a preschooler, but it has definitely shaped my life and is responsible for what I've turned out as. That's a fiction writer, not a vampire. But I was just absolutely obsessed with this show. It had vampires, it had werewolves, it had witches, it had all kinds of spooky stuff. But Barnabas was, I think, really one of the original, if not the original, sympathetic vampire. He didn't want to be a vampire. He wanted to regain his humanity. He fell in love. He'd had a tragic backstory. And so I was just, obsessed with it. I always joke that other little kids, if they got an empty cardboard box, would turn it into a boat or a plane or a car. I made mine into a coffin and rose from it. So, and if you know me, you can see that happening. So yeah, definitely Barnabas Collins.
All right, great. And you, Michele?
I think I first started paying attention to vampires with Salem's Lot, which was a miniseries back in the 80s. So I was probably like a teenager, and it was terrifying to me in terms of both, David Soul being the vampire slayer, so to speak, and then the kind of nature of evil. I would say when I was in college and I saw The Hunger, that gave me a very different understanding of vampires, more as in kind of the erotic, sensual tradition. And then I moved on to Anne Rice. And I have to say that my Blood Savior story is actually my first attempt at a vampire story. And so I'm kind of new to really thinking about, writing about vampires, even though I've really enjoyed watching stories about vampires for years.
I never saw the miniseries of Salem's Lot, but the book scared the crap out of me when I was a kid. I think I was 10 or 11 when I read it, which, similar to Gail watching Dark Shadows as a preschooler, my parents were not vetting my reading material.
All right, now this kind of goes a little bit off that, but I'll start with you, Jeremy. What, after seeing it in comics, what was it that both attracted you about vampires and what scared you or terrified you with them?
I don't know that I ever found vampires scary. I just, when I started reading heavily in vampires, it was the the White Wolf vampire RPG era and Anne Rice, and vampires were cool. They weren't scary. Well, they were scary to the people who weren't the main characters, if that makes sense.
All right, definitely. How about you, Gail?
I agree with Jeremy that I've never found them to be as scary as some other kind of monsters, depending on how the vampires created in that world. If they're sentient, then they're just an enhanced human, and humans can be monsters too. If they're the ravening beast kind of vampire, the Nosferatu sort of ghoul vampire, then that's much more into the Walking Dead sort of thing, where you've got a true monster. But someone with sentience and a good tuxedo, I mean, I would love to just sit them down and let them talk about all the things they've seen over their long life. Hell, I'd open a vein for that. That would be good stuff. So yeah, I'm much more intrigued than afraid.
Do you think it's because of Barnabas being your first?
I think it's probably, I don't see vampires as any scarier than the worst human beings. And so just because they're faster about it, Jeffrey Dahmer used his teeth too. So, maybe because Barnabas didn't scare me, maybe that helped, but I just find them complex and fascinating. And how much, if you can get as dysfunctional as most people are in a normal human lifespan, how much more screwed up can you get over several centuries? It just boggles the imagination.
Michele?
Yeah, I think following up on what Gail said, I think I've always been interested in some of the moral choices that vampires have to make if they're portrayed as thinking beings, because being the idea of being alive over centuries and the kinds of ways in which you have to build community or not build community, right? Because in Anne Rice's universe, vampires are very solitary compared to like the Twilight saga, right? Where, you know, vampires form families and things like that. So I think I've always been intrigued with the moral choices and also intrigued by, you know, the kinds of things that you can know, the kinds of things that you can learn over a long period of time is pretty cool. And also they often have great fashion. I have to say, at least Hollywood depictions of them, they're great. They were very sharply dressed. So I always like that.
All right. How about you, John?
You know, after the Baron Blood, then probably Salem's Lot was my next foray into vampire fiction. And then it was Interview with the Vampire. So the versatility of the monster was what captured me. In Salem's Lot, they were very much those ravening creatures. And in Interview with the Vampire, he was kind of charming and kind of tortured and all this. And so the flexibility of the base was really interesting, and I wanted to see what other people would do with it.
All right. Now, the next question I have, I'll go ahead and start with you, Gail. Now, you said vampires show up in everything urban fantasy you write at some point or another.
And epic, pretty much, yeah.
So is there anything that you haven't done with a vampire yet that you want to, or that you don't want to?
Well, I think it's really funny that we, thanks to, you know, Interview with the Vampire and Twilight and a lot of other things, a lot of people have only experienced vampires as an urban fantasy character. And I remember one of the early reviews that I got on my Chronicles of the Necromancer series, where there is a blood council and there are vampires that are very powerful who do get involved to an extent in mortal affairs. And one reviewer said that they thought it was so creative to reimagine the vampire in a Middle Ages type of setting. And I'm going, hello, Vlad the Impaler, you know, the original Drac. And I just thought that was really funny because there's, you know, kind of a whole generation that thinks of them only in urban fantasy and not really in any other setting. I liked using vampires because of the history piece. They have a different perspective. And you know, they also have part of that long life is looking at mortal affairs going, oh God, not this again. Didn't we just finish this? Seriously, we got to do this again. So if you think that's bad, like once you hit 40 and you're going, really? Imagine being 400. And I liked that they could bring that perspective, especially to somebody who was a king who was willing to listen. There was a lot of depth there, as well as everybody is a sucker, no pun intended, for the wounded bad boy.
Now, do you prefer your vampires as protagonist or the villain?
Mine are generally important secondary characters, but so far they haven't been either the protagonist. They haven't been the protagonist, and they haven't been the main villain. And that's just been because of the way the stories, the plot was set up. They played a very important secondary role and a continuing role from book to book. And since all of my urban fantasy series, as Gail and Morgan, overlap from series to series, but particularly in my urban fantasy, Soren is a champion of, he runs the Alliance, which is a coalition of mortals and immortals that save the world from supernatural threats. So he's a good guy.
All right.
But he's not the main character.
Okay. So what about you, Michele? Something that, now that you've written that story in Slay, something you'd like to do with a vampire, or something that you don't ever want to touch, like sparkles, for instance.
Sparkles get a bad rap. No, sparkles are great. Well, I will just say, kind of connecting back to the previous question, one of the things that I think is really cool about Slay is that it tries to reimagine, as someone was saying, that the vampire myth is so versatile, but it's never really, we've never looked at, what would it be like to tell stories from kind of across the African diaspora, which is what Slay tries to do. So there's 28 stories in the anthology. And so I think that just is kind of opening up all of these different questions about, vampire slayers and vampires, and, drawing on Haitian mythology and West African mythology. But for me, it opened up really a whole new world. The short story is something that I hope down the line I could actually turn into a novel. It deals with humans. It's an urban fantasy story, deals with humans, vampires, and fae, and really it tries to ask this moral question of what would one do to save their own kind or their own race? Would they enslave another? And there's basically there happens to be a virus. I'm obsessed with writing about viruses even prior to the time that we're in, and vampires are not doing so well. And it could be if they enslave perhaps another magical group, it might be that they get a cure. And so there's sort of a tension and debate about, should we do that, and what does that mean? Right.
And I'll ask you as well, do you like the idea of the vampire as the good guy or the bad guy?
Well, right now that I have a building a world that's going to have a lot of complexity in terms of both as protagonist and antagonist. So I think I have to write more in that world to know. And one of the books I also kind of want to mention is kind of playing with that is Octavia Butler's last book, Fledgling, which kind of really completely reimagines the vampire myth. And if people haven't read that, it's a really interesting and powerful story. Without giving too much away, she completely reimagines the vampire myth.
All right, great. And John, since you're done writing.
Yeah, sorry, making a note to pick up Fledgling by Octavia Butler.
Exactly.
So I created a series with vampire protagonists as a joke. I was watching True Blood, and I thought there should be more fat vampires. Fat people have more blood. There's just more room. It takes more blood. We're slow. It's a target-rich environment. So I thought, well, if I'm going to have a fat vampire, standard comedic trope is you got a fat guy and a short fat guy and a tall, really skinny guy. So I have two best friends. One's a skinny, tall, goofy guy, and one's a short, fat, smart guy. I'm writing Vampire Abbott and Costello. I just made them nerds. And then in the rest of my series, they have been crucial secondary characters. They have been one-off villains. I had a vampire cast of the Nutcracker tour through Charlotte in a Bubba the Monster Hunter story because I worked in theater for many, many years, and the idea of massacring an entire Nutcracker appealed to me. So that was my justification for murdering the entire cast of Nutcracker. So, I used, and I write Dracula. Dracula himself is a character in my Quincy Harker series. Quincy Harker, canonically, Quincy Harker was created by Bram Stoker. I didn't create the character of Quincy Harker. Well, I created this Quincy Harker. Bram Stoker made a Quincy Harker baby that never did anything. I made a 130-year-old wizard. But he's the son of Jonathan Harker and Mina Murray. So in my world, he grew up with Dracula as Uncle Luke. So I used them as all across the spectrum. The one thing I haven't done that I would like to, I haven't written a vampire horror story. I haven't actually played with a really scary vampire. I've had vampires be the bad guy in a novella or in a novel, but nothing that was straight horror. So if anybody out there is putting together an anthology, I'm currently taking bookings for late 21 and 2022.
So even though you haven't done that horror, and you've done a bunch of the protagonists, I ask you as well, do you like the idea of them more? Are they better fit for
I feel
villain?
like they can be anything.
Right.
They can be any. I think that they are, most of the time, they serve better as a strong secondary character, because then their moments of inhumanity hold up a really interesting distorted mirror to your human protagonist. So when I'm working with the Black Knight Chronicles, where I have 2 vampire protagonists, I then have human secondary characters to be that distorted funhouse mirror of my inhuman characters. Also, my vampires in that series are very young. They are my age. They're 47, because that makes the math easy.
All right, thank you. Jeremy.
I don't know. It's something that I would like to do that I haven't done. When I first started building the Void City universe, I did a lot of research into different cultures, vampires, and that for a long time there was a note that I was trying to work in, which is, okay, wait, Nukakube, they're a Asian vampire and their heads come off. All right, so I have to work in a fight with one of them in a bowling alley.
Ooh.
And it took 4 books, but that finally happened. And so now I have these others that are kind of grotesque, and I'm like, well, it's you get some interesting view into culture when you're like, okay, so this culture created a vampire legend where the vampire is basically a uterus. Okay. And so, I mean, theoretically that's in there, but the real idea for me is just to keep making vampires that make sense and find a way to work in each different culture and in a way that works and is entertaining, but isn't shoehorning it in, if that makes any sense.
Okay, and I'll throw it out to you as well. Hero or villain?
I don't know why the hero shouldn't also be the villain. So anti-hero, I guess, is my choice in one of the things I'm currently writing. One of my favorite characters to write is my main character in the Void City series, daughter Greta. She is absolutely the monster that he is afraid he is. And she is so fun to write. She is absolutely insane. And she's the antagonist in the current book I'm writing. So that will be interesting to see. Well, one, does she work that way? Because when you're on her side, it's kind of cute when she's talking to somebody about what movies they're going to see, and they're talking about date night, and then she just kills them because she's hungry. And you're like, oh, that Greta, she's so crazy. But then when you're on the other side of the fence, and then suddenly you know that the person that the protagonist is talking to may kill them at any moment, that makes it a little more interesting.
That's perfect. Now, I'll go to you, Michele. It was mentioned the last time we had one of these panels that it's pretty one-sided with vampires that we see. And you mentioned it with Slay, that it's about the African diaspora. What do you want to see more from vampires? And Jeremy mentioned the Japanese or the Asian vampires as well. what do you want to see more of in fiction related to that?
Yeah, I think for me, trying to imagine how vampires have, uh, dealt with kind of various social challenges and social problems as communities, I think is really interesting. And some of that gets taken up in Slay, but also thinking about, different kinds of rites of passage that involve vampiric experiences. So I know in one of the stories, there's a mother-daughter, it's a mother-daughter story, and it's a group of, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the author's name, but from what I understand, the mothers they have teenage daughters, and they kind of have been getting together for years and years and years. The daughters are upstairs, the mothers are downstairs, and the daughters think, oh, those mothers, they're so boring. They're out there just like drinking wine or whatever. And over time, it gets revealed that the mothers are going to actually introduce the daughters to their vampiric tradition through a blood rite of passage. So like kind of first blood, menstruation. I mean, it's just really interesting. So I think it's trying to kind of broaden out the scope of what we think of as both vampires and vampire traditions. And I think that can look a lot of different ways.
Okay. John.
I kind of want to see anything that I haven't seen a million times. I want to see vampire traditions from other cultures. I want to see vampire traditions that affect other cultures. What kind of culture shock do you get when an Eastern European 400-year-old vampire goes to Delhi? How does that work? What happens when a vampire who's been just kind of chilling on a mountain in Tibet comes down to the village for his monthly lunch? I want to see, there's a lot of either brooding white dudes or sexy, smoldering anti-hero white guys with guns on the cover and purple fart magic smoke around them. There's a ton of that. I want to see things that are different. I mean, there's even a bunch of people writing vampire nerds, for God's sake. I do a podcast with 2 other guys who write nerdy vampires. So I want to see more. Like, I'm excited to read Slay because it's different. Nothing against Sparkling. Sparkling was different. Rock On. It was something new. Anything new. I'd kind of like to see somebody remake Blade.
All right. Jeremy?
Oh wow, that's a hard one. I mean, because basically, yeah, cool stories with vampires in them doesn't really, so long as the story's good. But I do agree with John that we do see a lot of the same thing. I mean, to be honest, that's why in Void City, that's why Eric is not in his 20s. He is not young and attractive. Being a vampire is a gross proposition, and I like that. It's one of the things that was so cool about, I'm blanking on his name, but Fat White Vampire Blues, with dealing with the idea of fatty lipids and how vampires in New Orleans got to watch because they can gain weight. Because the food is so rich in New Orleans, you got to watch yourself, even if you're a vampire. And John's approach to fat vampires. So yeah, I hate to give the same answer, but basically it is the same answer. John, anything new, anything cool, and particularly different voices, people from different backgrounds than mine. I really enjoy seeing that take, because they're going to come up with stories that I never would. It was a short conversation with I'm blanking, a young Jewish author that made me think of, he's a side character, but Dr. Fish that we'll meet in book 5. He's called Dr. Fish because he's a Jewish vampire, and he tries to adhere to rabbinical law, so the only blood he's allowed to drink is fish blood. And, to stay in adherence. And then later I was told, technically, since you're allowed to violate the various food laws to preserve life, technically, he likes to try to keep it as close. So just, stuff like that, but from people other than me, if that makes sense.
All right. Gail.
I would love to see more vampires from the ancient cultures, from India, from China, from indigenous peoples, from the Mayans and the Aztecs and the ancient cultures. Whether we're seeing them when their culture was ascendant or whether we're seeing them now. But I think that would be very interesting if it's done well and well researched, because you're drawing from very different mythology, very different perspectives on life and death, very different ideas of morality in some cases, and it would be totally out of the Judeo-Christian framework that we often see vampires in. I enjoy seeing people play with that trope, even if they are writing, Western European vampires. The idea that a lot of the propaganda that's been spread about vampires is incorrect. So my Deadly Curiosity series, Soren has no problem walking into a church. He is mildly irritated by silver, kind of like a bad rash. But the only blood he may not consume is the Eucharist. And as someone raised Catholic, that bothers him. So, I like to see those little kinds of twists, even if we are looking at a Northwestern European culture, because there's always some way to kind of switch things up a little bit and go, okay, that's what everybody's expecting. As long as it's consistent with my world building and it has a good reason, how can I put my own little signature on this? And that to me is part of the fun.
All right, perfect.
Sorry, Gail. Sorry.
How do I compete with a cat,
Well, Hawk would like to contribute that since he had to have one of his canines removed this year, that he would like to see stories about vampires with only one fang. He would like to see some representation, right, buddy?
All right. So kind of finishing off with that, like you guys were saying, we've been inundated with that Eastern European vampire. Basically, it seems since Dracula, even though the first mention of a vampire was back in 1047, I believe. So just one more thing before we do wrap it up today, though. Since we're getting close to Halloween, I'd like everyone to go around and give us, other than your books, which of course we want everyone to buy and read, a suggestion you have for some Halloween reading. And we'll start with you, John.
So if you like the kinds of stuff that I write, you should absolutely check out Drew Hayes' series, Fred the Vampire Accountant, and Rick Gualtieri's Tome of Bill series. Both of those are excellent. And also Christopher Moore has some fantastic vampire comedy books set in San Francisco, and they feature Emperor Norton, the Emperor of San Francisco. So those are three. I'll just go ahead and corner the market on vampire comedy. And, anything Jeff Strand writes, because he'd be funny. And he's got a new book out called Autumn Bleeds into Winter that everyone should check out. It's great.
All right. Jeremy.
I mean, other than, you know, books like Salem's Lot and Where the True Horror of Vampires, I think one of the most brutal books featuring vampires I've ever read is Nancy A. Collins' Sonia Blue series. If you just want to see the truly dark side of not just vampires but also fairy tales, man, she's got some really brutal stuff.
Okay. And Gail.
Well, I'm going to suggest a few from the Morgan Bryce side of my life in the urban fantasy male paranormal romance. One series that I absolutely love is Jacqueline Osborne's Lords of Discord. And it is about 4 different vampire brothers, all of whom were turned by their stepfather. There was a good reason. It was consensual. And it's how they find their forever partners in a very dangerous world where the vampires don't tend to play well with each other outside of the family. So you've got this really tightly knit group of brothers, and it's kind of them against the world. So I love that series. The other one that really just serves up something unexpected is Liv Rancourt and Irene Preston's Hours of the Night series. And you've got a vampire who used to be a Catholic monk, so there's all kinds of, you know, guilt and self-loathing. And because he is gay and, you know, the church wasn't cool with that, he needs a Renfield. He needs a human assistant who can go out during daylight hours and do stuff for him. And he always makes sure he hires a female because he doesn't want to be tempted. Well, his, you know, friend who hires this for him hires Sarah, who resume looks great, except Sarah's Indian and Sarah is short for a very, very long Hindu name. And Sarah's definitely not female. And so this leads to the whole angsty falling in love. And what's really fun with this series is because Sarah comes from the Hindu tradition, all of the Catholic baggage about so many things, he's going, yeah, whatever. That's really, I don't buy into that. So what's the problem? And that is such a breath of fresh air. So I definitely recommend both of those series.
Perfect. And Michele, other than Fledgling, what do you got to suggest?
Well, some people have already read this, but I came to it late. I recently finished Dr. Sleep by Stephen King, and I think that's an amazing example of how to get so great interiority into an antagonist who and kind of rethinks the vampire tradition. But I also want to give people a classic that often gets left out of the kind of vampire kind of canon, and that is published a while ago by Julia Gomez, and it's called The Gilda Chronicles, and it's a kind of a queer vampire love story, epic saga, very compelling, very literary, also great in terms of kind of the horror elements. And so it's just if people are looking for something kind of that gave rise to what we think of as kind of modern queer vampire fiction and representation, they should definitely check it out. Gilda Chronicles.
All right, great, perfect. All right, guys, again, thank you for attending, and we'll go around the room one more time so that you can let people know where to find you on your socials. We'll start with you, Jeremy.
You can find me at jflewis.net and at jf_Lewis on Twitter.
All right, perfect. And Gail?
You can find me at gailzmartin.com and morganbryce.com. That's BRICE, and Twitter at Gail Z Martin, at Morgan Bryce Book. Everything else is either Gail Z Martin, GZ Martin, or Morgan Bryce. I'm pretty easy to find out there.
All right, Michele.
And you can find me at Twitter, Michele with 1 L, MICHELET, and then BERGER, and my website is michelleberger.wordpress.com.
All right, and finally, John.
You can find me at johnhartness.com or at falstaffbooks.com, and you can find Puck makes many appearances in my Facebook group, which is John G. Hartness Books. So if you join my Facebook group, you will get to see as much, my God, he's heavy kitty as you can handle.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for viewing. We'll see you guys next week. Bye.
Bye.